Since the Israel-Hamas war erupted in Gaza, leaders of many countries have consistently said that the only way out is to create two states, one for the Israelis and another for the Palestinians. US President Joe Biden has made this idea the very cornerstone of his proposed solution to end this protracted war. But it's not just Biden. Leaders worldwide, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, French President Emmanuel Macron, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and even the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have echoed this idea. They are all in unanimity that the sustainable long-term solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict is a two-state solution. On Crux Decode, we analyze why the two-state solution is as good as dead on arrival. In fact, far from being a solution, this could only further complicate the problem. Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly rejected the two-state solution, and that sparked widespread expressions of surprise and even outrage. However, such a reaction in itself is at odds with what Netanyahu has stood for all along. The Israeli Prime Minister could be charged with genocide and other war crimes, but inconsistency, particularly on the Palestinian statehood question, that is not something he can be accused of. On a separate state of Palestine, he has sometimes overtly and sometimes covertly opposed the idea of a separate state since the signing of the Oslo Accords back in 1993. The Israeli parliament narrowly approved the Oslo Accords after a bitter debate, and there were eruptions of violence as well. The most famous victim of the violence that followed the Oslo Accords was the then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was killed by a Jewish extremist in 1995. But there were undeniable signs that the political will to create two states was simply not there. There was exponential growth in the colonization of the West Bank. In fact, more than 3/4 of today's settlers have arrived there since the signing of the Oslo Accords. What it has done is that there are more people and more land today that is controlled by Israel within the borders of West Bank than there are people or land controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And that makes the very essence of a two-state solution meaningless. Meanwhile, none of the Arab or Muslim countries that had built their legitimacy supporting the Palestinian cause since 1948, none of them could afford to abandon the cause. In short, the so-called two-state solution did not die because leaders failed to implement it. It died because it was never a solution. It was never the silver bullet that it was meant to be. After the outbreak of the current war, global and regional powers have got huge interests at stake. There have been massive disruptions to shipping lines in the Red Sea. There is growing risk of a major regional war. All the more reason why the global community should be pushing for a workable solution. The United States seems cornered to the point of being unable to compel Israel to comply to a two-state solution. China and Russia, on the other hand, simply want to capitalize on the situation by twisting the knife into America's wound. And Europe, including Britain, has nothing to say because they are not players anymore, certainly not since the Oslo Accords, where they have been completely sidelined from the equation. There are two reasons why the two-state solution will not work. Because first, the two-state hypothesis, triumphantly launched by the United States more than 3 decades ago, has long been considered dead. If it hasn't worked in the last 30 years, it is highly unlikely it will work now. It also highlights the inability of world leaders to propose a more credible solution. Second, the two-state solution, were it ever to be imposed, would certainly result in what many call a new Nakba, or a catastrophe, that would make the 1948 Nakba and the war happening right now appear minor in comparison. The only comparable case to the two-state solution that many wish for Israel and Palestine is the partition of India. The short-sighted British decision to divide Hindus and Muslims in 1947 demonstrates that you can't just draw lines on a map and then expect people who have lived together for years to suddenly just up and leave. It will, as in the case of India and Pakistan, lead to a bloodshed of a colossal scale. The number of people slaughtered or expelled at the time of the creation of India and Pakistan is literally incalculable. After the Punjab, which was suddenly split in half between India and Pakistan, about 6.5 million Muslims and about 4.5 million Hindus and Sikhs were thrown out. It saw religious riots in which more than 500,000 people were killed. The scars of the partition have affected more than 2 generations of Indians and Pakistanis who came after. The total numbers of murders, rapes, and other violent crimes which forced the refugees to leave their homes have never been fully accounted for. Neither Indians nor Pakistanis want to go back to those dark days, which were a bloodbath. It separated friends and neighbors who had lived next to each other for generations. And mind you, it didn't just end there. For 3/4 of a century since then, India and Pakistan have fought as many as 4 wars. Hundreds of thousands of people have become victims of terrorism. And this is also a fault line that's been exploited in the past by world powers like the US and Soviet Union, and now increasingly by China. Beyond the death and destruction, one must also remember that ethnic cleansing has always impoverished countries that were involved. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain around the 16th century, that triggered a prolonged economic crisis. During the formation of so-called nation-states, there were instances of ethnic self-mutilation which became almost commonplace. To give you some examples, the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews, all pillars of the Ottoman Empire, were almost entirely removed from Turkish territory between 1915 and 1992, as was the Muslim population in the Balkans between 1875 and 1913. After 1945, after the Second World War, as many as 13 million Germans were expelled from Central and Eastern Europe, all of them carried out under the deceptive idea of establishing a nation-state along ethnic and religious lines. More recently, the clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan around the Nagorno-Karabakh region are another example of people who have a common history, who were separated on religious and ethnic lines, and then they resort to violence on the back of what is perceived grievances. It was a classic case of how can someone else take our land and our people. Finally, one more compelling reason. It would be naive, to say the least, to hope that Arabs who have Israeli citizenship or Jewish settlers in the West Bank would be allowed to live in peace in an ethnically pure Israel or an ethnically pure Palestine. As the example of India and Pakistan show, such a climate would be allowed to remain peaceful in an ethnically pure Israel, or that Jewish settlers would be allowed to remain peaceful in an ethnically pure West Bank. Hopefully, the world will learn the right lessons from the partition of India and Pakistan and apply the same to what many are saying is the 2-state solution, which is the only workable one between Israel and Palestine.